everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. So super excited to have Pierre Paslier today from Notpla on board. Before I start to introducing our guest, just briefly introducing myself. I'm Max Leveau. I'm CEO of Forward Fooding. And for the ones who don't know Forward Fooding, we've been around for almost 4 years now, and our role is basically to help making connections within the agri-food tech sector between corporate food organizations and the startups that are bringing impactful innovations to the food industry and trying to help them to scale via the peers of corporates. We also have developed a data platform that provides investors, accelerators, and corporates with a global database of startups in the agri-food tech space, and also trends and insights about what's happening in the industry. So without further notice, our guest today is Pierre Notpla. Super excited to have you on board because we give a lot of presentations about food tech, whether it is for clients or in other circumstances. And every time we have to give examples of impactful startups, and pretty much every time we quote Notpla as one of the examples, because I think to me is really what the essence of what food tech is all about. So Notpla, basically their mission is to get rid of single-use plastic. They have developed this innovative material that is a blend of algae and plants, and it's also edible. Their first product is actually an edible capsule for liquids. And so without further notice, Pierre, if you could start by giving us a bit of history, so telling us a bit about yourself, your background, and how the whole Notpla project came together.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be contributing to the food tech community, and I think that it's an exciting time for the food tech community. There's lots of challenges ahead, so innovators and entrepreneurs have a lot of work. So I'm Pierre. I'm French, and just for like a little bit of context, I initially studied mechanical engineering back in France, and then I worked as a packaging engineer for a few years for L'Oreal, the cosmetics company. And there I kind of like learned a lot of things about industrialization, but I also realized the scale at which we produce plastic and the speed at which those machines just kind of like fill shampoo bottles and like cream jars and so on. So it's kind of like a bit of a realization that if we make it that fast, it ends up somewhere. And so after working a few years there, I decided to make a change, and that's when I came to the UK to study a master's in innovation, where I met my co-founder, Rodrigo. His background is in architecture, so so far nothing related to seaweed or chemistry or anything, but we basically decided to work on what essentially was a student project at that point, trying to come up with an alternative to the quintessential waste product, the single like use plastic bottle, in a way that would feel like nature would have this as an existing like element. So the idea was to create a little bit like a man-made fruit that would be an example of how nature would try to bring you water or different types of liquids. And around that time, we kind of like did a lot of research around natural materials, and we didn't really have a lab, so we just were experimenting in our kitchens and reading a lot of old patents from the 20s from the food industry. We stumbled upon a lot of materials that are quite interesting in their properties, from tapioca seeds to starches and cellulose, and eventually we stumbled upon a lot of seaweed extracts that are used in the food industry as thickeners and gelling agents. And we kind of realized that they were working quite well for making small bubbles, for example, for making fake caviar. And it's kind of magic. You just combine those extracts from seaweed with some salts, and you have like these kind of bubbles, very small, that you could produce. And we kind of like just spent a few weeks trying to make them as big as possible, containing water. And essentially at that point we had an interesting prototype, but it was very loose. There was very there was a lot of problems. It would break within 5 minutes and so on. But we made a video showing how you could basically make this a bit as a tutorial. And the project wasn't really kind of like meant to go further than this, but we posted this online, and following that video, there was a lot of kind of like other like videos trying to kind of like work around the initial method, trying to improve things. Eventually that video went viral, and we kind of realized that people were really excited about this as an alternative to plastic. And the first kind of like articles were written about this as packaging, as really an alternative packaging. So when we graduated, rather than going to find a job in a bigger company, we were like, okay, let's give it a shot, maybe just for 6 months, see what happens. But can we bring this from concept to kind of like having impact? And that's when we really kind of like jumped on this seriously. We started working with a few chemists from Imperial College where we were studying, and then like brought together a wider team of like engineers and designers and business developers, and worked on the material properties, the manufacturing technology, to try to make this as well more kind of like scalable. And it took us a few years, but we kind of like managed to create a little bit more of a like solid solution that could really have an impact against plastic. And I think that at that point we kind of like decided to focus on specific applications where our products are more suitable. So one of the things that is quite exciting about Notpla, which is also the name of our material, is, as you said, that it's made from natural material. So it's renewables. It's not using any fossil fuel or anything like this. And because it's natural and it's like plants and seaweed, it's actually edible. So you can literally eat the packaging, and that's in a way the fastest way to make it disappear. You can also throw it away, and it's naturally biodegradable. Unlike PLA or PHAs or other types of bioplastics, you don't need industrial composting. So it means that wherever this packaging ends up, nature can deal with it. The idea is like, if nature can, like if you can eat it, nature can eat it. And so the response from the market was that like there was a really good fit with instant consumption. So that's when we started to look at places where you use something within minutes or even seconds, and where it doesn't make sense to use plastic that is virtually indestructible and is going to stay in the environment for a very long time. So that's when we started to do a lot of running events like the London Marathon. We did a lot of festivals, sampling, and now a lot on the takeaway side of things. And so that's really now where we focus our attention, the on-the-go consumption markets, where a natural material has the best chance of replacing what currently is usually plastic or laminates. And yeah, that's a bit about the story.
Great. It's quite a journey. So how long did it take from the moment you start looking into the idea until the moment you had your first prototype? How long was that particular journey?
So I think it was quite fast, because we were like really trying to piggyback on a lot of existing technologies. So the first membranes, the first prototypes, they were very fragile. They were definitely more from the food world than from the packaging world, if that makes sense. But we were able to replicate, as I said, like the way you make fake caviar with some seaweed extracts. We were ordering a bunch of raw ingredients from Alibaba and Amazon, mixing it in our kitchen. So I think that it was definitely a very kind of hands-on project to start with. And then obviously to make it into a packaging that is robust, that is safe, that is hygienic, that like solves a real kind of like consumption problem. It then took a lot of work from chemists and chemical engineers and the different team members to improve this. So it's been really continuous improvement. But I think one of the things that worked quite well for us to get started is that we had like something quite visual that was also quite tangible. People, because they saw it, they kind of like related to it. And so I think that, it's been a very kind of like hands-on project from the start, and it's allowed us to kind of like convince people faster of the technology so that we can get to the really interesting thing, which is about like building, scaling up, and making sure that we have the impact that we want to have.
Great. And so you mentioned like the final product, the final material is 100% biodegradable, edible, means no waste, no beans, no recycling, and your first product was the form of a little capsule. But I just wanted to come back on the material, the ingredients that you're using to get to that particular material. So you mentioned like you told me the other day that the algae you're using can grow up to 3 meters a day. Can you tell us a bit more about the particular elements that you're using for Notpla?
Yeah, so certainly seaweed is a incredible material. We really think that it has a big role to play in sustainable packaging. I think that there's many things that are quite unbelievable about seaweed. It's a very ancient, in a way, kind of like organism that is behaving in extraordinary ways. So first of all, as you said, it grows extremely fast. Some seaweeds that we've tried in the past, they can grow up to 1 meter per day. So it's just like one of the fastest growing organism on the planet. And what's really interesting as well is that it's a zero input crop, if that makes sense. So you don't need fresh water, you don't need fertilizer, you don't need temperature control or any of the other things that are sometimes required in agriculture, and you don't use land. And one of the things that is really important for sustainable packaging is to kind of like take care of the ethical considerations of diverting the use of like land and agriculture from food to bio packaging. That's one of the big problems of PLA, for example. Yeah. And so seaweed in that sense has a really big opportunity to provide that biomass without that issue. It's vegan. There's lots of biomaterials that are using like either gelatin or milk proteins, but seaweed is vegan. And one of the things that is really interesting as well is that it's actually like helping the ocean to reduce acidity by circulating the nutrients and the carbon. It's a really great way to capture carbon. So actually there's more and more projects where they're looking at actually kind of like cultivating seaweed in like 3D farms in the ocean just for the carbon capture element. And obviously we are trying to develop more applications for those kind of like types of biomass to also have like an end market to try to accelerate the growth of this. But it just wins on all the aspects. And one element that is maybe not so important for us right now, but that needs to be taken into account as we scale up, is that it's also available like all around the world. And one of the things that we have done is test species from different parts of the world, different oceans, to make sure that when we are at scale and we are producing Oohos in Australia, we're not shipping seaweed from France. And it does work. There's lots of ways to balance the variations from fishes. So it's quite exciting in terms of raw material. Obviously, like any human activity, when it comes to extraction or harvesting or like aquaculture, humans can always have a negative impact. So that's why we also work really closely with the rest of the supply chain so that people are encouraged to have the best behaviors and the best like impact they can. And I think that it's really important for any kind of like new material to make sure that we don't hide another problem a bit further down the chain. We don't want to create the next ecological crisis. So we really work to make sure that there's nothing that is not accounted for.
Okay, so where do you currently harvest the algae?
So currently we use mainly seaweed from France, not because I'm French, but because we have a partner there who is really kind of like having the best sustainability credentials, and we want to like reward those with our kind of like small buying power for now, but we want to work with the people who are like pushing as much as possible for the most responsible way to to process the seaweed. But we've tested seaweed from all around the world. So there's a lot of a lot of potential.
Yeah, great. Talking about that, actually, so first of all, first question I had was to come back on the product itself. We're talking about something edible. When you talk about something edible, you have to talk about shelf life. So, what's the current shelf life of the packaging? And the
Yeah,
second question is like, what other applications are you currently looking at? What other packaging formats are you exploring?
great. So absolutely, I think one of the big kind of like elements about our product is that we have the shelf life of a fruit more than the shelf life of an industrial container, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, one of the things that is quite interesting is that our material is naturally biodegradable. Um, and typically it will break down into compost in like 4 to 6 weeks. So you can't really have something that is that biodegradable, but that's going to be on the shelf for 3 years. And so to solve this, first of all, we had to focus on applications where there is fast consumption. So again, the on-the-go market is great because you know that people are going to consume at that moment, and you can work around that. And the second one is related to the manufacturing. And so the material is one part of the technology, but the other part is the machines that we have developed that can manufacture Oohos. And unlike traditional packaging, plastic packaging technologies, they're actually much more compact. And the idea is to actually have a very small supply chain and production locally. So the idea is that you could literally produce close to the point of consumption, like a hub model, where you don't have to have one giant factory for an entire country or even a continent, and you just ship things in trucks for months and months, but you can just produce locally, fresh, around the corner. So the fact that we've made this machine small, low energy intensity, and basically the scale of a fridge, we can have this distributed model where we can produce locally and have that product reach the market faster. The shelf life really depends on what we put inside. And it's quite interesting because a bit like fruit, there's no two fruits that have exactly the same behavior because they have different requirements, they contain different elements. So for us, it's very similar. We have some products that have like a lot more stability. We've done, for example, ketchup and mayo sachets for the takeaway industry, and usually they have like lower pH and they are more stable. Whereas we've been working with fresh cold pressed juice, and those will have literally a shelf life of like 4 days. So it really depends on what you're packaging, and the way we set up the shelf life is essentially looking at two things. The first one is microbiology. So when there is actually like the starting point of growth of microorganism beyond the limits that are set by the company that is producing the content. And the second one is organoleptic. So does it still feel like the product that the consumers like and recognize? So we really work case by case with companies, from sauces with Hellmann's from Unilever, where we would have teams really looking at each different sauce, to, as I mentioned before, for example, Tropicana with the cold pressed juice being a lot more kind of rigorous on that. And then on the other products, so you're absolutely right. We started with Ooho, but actually we started developing other packaging solutions based on the same seaweed technology because we saw that there was other ways we could have an impact. So the second product is a coating. I have an example here. So this is a takeaway box that you would get your curry or your noodles in. It's cardboard, but inside it's coated with a thin layer of our seaweed material to provide the water resistance and the grease proofing. And typically this is done with plastic, whereas with seaweed, you have something that is natural and biodegradable. So that's something that we are currently trialing with Just Eat in London restaurants. And the third product is essentially a transparent film, but for dry products. So this is basically for packaging either dry food or hardware components or electronics, different things that are in flexible, transparent packaging and that don't really need to be in plastic. And that's something that is a little bit earlier stage, but we're quite excited to see how we're going to be able to bring this to the market.
And that makes me jump on the question I just saw popping on screen. Like, do you at the moment have any kind of limitations in terms of sizes for these packagings?
So not really. The way we produce the sachets is by extrusion. So you could make a very long tube, if that makes sense, but it's not very practical. What we have found is that because we are all about on-the-go consumption, we tend to have small formats because that's what people tend to consume on the go. But I think the biggest Ooho we've made one summer for like a record was 2 liters. So you could make it pretty big, but it wouldn't be very convenient. And for the films or for the coating, there's no limit. It's really like basically we are creating a roll of film that we can then transform into different size of flexible bags.
Great. And is it printable? Did you have any requests from any customers in the past that were asking to put some branding on the packaging?
So absolutely. And like traditionally packaging is real estate for brands. So they are really keen to have at the minimum some legal information, and at the like very quickly they're interested in like branding. For the films and for the coating, it's relatively easy to use traditional printing techniques. For the Ooho sachets, because the membrane is quite specific and we've had to develop this technology and this machine from scratch. Currently, we don't have an automatic printer at the end of our machine, if that makes sense. We have developed the ink and we have that working in the lab. So I think that we are probably like 6 months to a year away from having it implemented. But for now, it hasn't stopped us from continuing to produce for all of the different applications. But obviously, it's going to be great once it's fully integrated.
Fantastic. And I remember like when I first encountered your company, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, you were pretty much at the early days, and I'm sure you had the question so many times. But the first thing that came to my mind was like, wow, that is great, but how scalable it is? And I'm sure you had tons of investors and corporates who ask you the question. Since then, you know, have like 20 plus employees. You just raised finance again, and you enable collaboration with companies like Unilever, Suntory, distributing, for example, these Oohos filled with glucosate sports drinks for the London Marathon. You mentioned that partnership you have with Just Eat and Hellman Sauces for the takeaway industry. The question I have is like how, if you could expand a bit more, particularly on these collaborations, and more than anything, like what were sort of like the highs and the lows when it comes to collaborating with these big organizations, and how do you envision these collaborations to evolve in the future?
Yeah, so I think definitely these collaborations are both important and they're hard to kind of like set up correctly, if that makes sense. We've talked with so many other companies, and in the end, those few that you mentioned are some of the ones we are the proudest of having like managed to create those relationships. I think that we really believe in starting small and not trying to solve everything at once, and that's definitely how we approach things with glucosate. For example, we literally started with like a small run where there were 200 runners. There was no media. There was no kind of like no pressure on seeing that the thing had to work. And we just kind of tested maybe 50 or 100 Oohos, got some feedback from the runners, and we just iterated. And that 200 runner race turned into 1,000 runners, and then 10,000, and then eventually to the London Marathon, 46,000 runners. So it's really kind of like taking this step-by-step approach and showing that like we can solve things as they come. That is working well for everyone. I think it's buying internally as well some validation, and for us it turned into Lucozade wanting to have Oohos for all of their events from now on in terms of sampling. So it really is taking it slowly at first and validating things rather than just trying to communicate about them. The case of Just Eat is very interesting because it was literally like a conversation where it was about finding one restaurant to just try the first ketchup sachets, and they were okay, no problem, we'll just do that and see what happens. And I remember the first delivery, like we didn't have the proper kind of like courier in place and so on. So the first kind of like boxes arrived and all the ketchup had exploded and it was a huge mess. And it was not a problem for them. They were like, yeah, we've learned that we shouldn't use that method. Let's try something else. And that summer we did, I don't know, like 5,000 sachets with that restaurant. And then it turned into a second phase where we had 10 restaurants, and then another phase where we involved Unilever, where we had 60 restaurants. So it really is about like that progressive way of solving things, knowing that there will be unknowns when we scale up, but we've proven that we have a track record of working these as we go. And now we have like a lot more companies reaching out, and usually we have a stage approach in terms of like structuring how we test things with their products before jumping into like a consumer test and then maybe a larger trial. So that helps them to understand what are the expectations, how we are going to frame it before we kind of like have the big rollout, if that makes sense.
And have you seen like some sort of like, if we exclude the past 3 months, I'd say the past year, have you seen some kind of like peak in a demand and interest from these big organizations?
I think what's super interesting is that even with what's happened in the last 3 months, like everyone has made it a priority on their agenda to deliver on plastic reduction or on like climate change. I think that it's gone from being the thing that we shove in the kind of like report at the end of the year to really being understanding that consumers will just go some other way if they don't find something that aligns with their values. And so it's been really interesting for us to see that commitment growing over the years. When we started, it was pre-David Attenborough, Blue Planet 2 kind of like emotional connection with the oceans, and it was a completely different world. People were a lot more cynical and didn't care about like the impact of their packaging. Now I think that like on the other side, yes, it's a corporation, but there's humans who also don't want to feel shitty about their work and what they are kind of like putting on the market. So I think that it goes a long way of like having that that personal rapport with the problem with everyone.
Yeah. And well, now let's talk about what happened in the past in the past 3 months. I think we can't avoid that. Basically, I see a lot of like single-use plastic resurging at the moment for like health and safety reasons. Would you say that Notpla was sort of like a COVID-proof business before the whole pandemic started, and how did it affect you?
So I think like everyone, there's been some disruption. We certainly have a part of our activity that is linked with events, and as long as people can't meet in large groups, these events will be postponed. So I think that it's going to take a few months before we are seeing those events restarting. I think that purely from like R&D perspective, obviously it's harder to work with international partners. Luckily, we are doing a lot of work with like industrial partners in the UK. So that helps a lot as well with trials continuing, with be able to like have a little bit more proximity and like understanding of how to work together. Whereas like trials with the US or with Southeast Asia are a lot more kind of like tricky at the moment. So there is a sense that like geography matters again, if that makes sense. And then, yeah, for us, like obviously production is stopped until some of these events restart. We have used that time to do a lot of R&D and to move into our new offices, which is quite exciting. We've been here for 2 weeks and it's much larger like facility, so that's great. We got quite lucky that in terms of timing that we fundraised in December. So we don't have the like the stress of like the cash flow for these months that commercial activity is still low, and we have the ability to get through and to really kind of like restart things properly in the coming months. So for us, we are in a way in a better position than some of the people who were actually just starting to fundraise. There is a lot of uncertainty in startups, so I think that it's been probably like on like the nerves of a lot of founders. But for us, we've kind of like tried to open our eyes to see what is going to be the most important in the coming months and year, and to try to accelerate that as much as we can while we have time for the chemists and the engineers and the designers to work.
Fantastic. And in this new kind of like normal, this new situation with the COVID pandemic, like what would you say is the biggest challenge of the food tech sector in the food industry at the moment?
I think what's going to be quite interesting is, as you said, like to predict which behaviors are going to quickly return to some of the previous behaviors that we had, and which ones are going to stick with the kind of like crisis mode that we're in, and trying to have a solution for almost for both, but like being ready to see some things stay like this, whereas some others are going to quickly kind of like return to what we knew before. And I think that for like the food tech community, and in general, I think for like startups, we are the people who are the most kind of like able to adapt quickly and to be resilient about like changing like context. So I'm not too afraid that people are going to quickly pivot to pick up an opportunity or wait for the behavior that they think is going to come back. I think that there's a lot more traditional businesses that are going to be impacted long term that aren't going to have that mentality and that ability to reinvent themselves. But in a way, I think that maybe it's just giving an opportunity as well for some of these like better solutions, more sustainable solutions, to take a little bit more of the grip on the market. And I think that what still feels like very important in all the discussions that I have with the bigger partners is the urgency of acting on like climate change and on plastic pollution, because I think that people are realizing that if we mistreat nature, we kind of like get hit, and we can't really afford to continue disregarding the kind of consequences that this could have. So I think that I'm really hopeful that this is going to change long term, like the way people behave and consume, and what better way than food for showing that change.
And aside from the alternative packaging sector, like what are the biggest trends that you see shaping up for the next 2-3 years in the whole food tech sector, according to you?
I think one of the things that is quite interesting that we're seeing, especially we have a lot of requests from cosmetics company around like waterless or reduced water content solutions. And I think with the probable boom of e-commerce related with COVID, it's going to be really interesting to try to transport things that are more concentrated. And I think that there's a lot of formats of packaging to invent or reinvent. I think that that's one area where it's quite exciting, and especially I think in terms of sustainability, like high water content solutions or formulations are typically harder to protect. So I think that it's also going to lift a lot of the requirements on packaging, because we can deal with products that are drier and therefore can afford to be paired with a more sustainable solution. So I think that's quite exciting. And I think that the other thing that is quite interesting is that although the plastics lobby is working really hard to try to like make everyone fearing everything that is not wrapped in plastic. There's some really great science showing that actually the virus tends to live much longer on plastic than other materials, especially natural materials. So it's quite interesting to see that actually we've had conversations with people who reached out because they wanted to stop using plastic because of the fact that it's a very stable surface for COVID. So is that going to be a major push against plastic? I don't know, but it's interesting to hear from the market.
Let's see. And it makes a great transition because I'm looking at, we have many questions actually from the audience right now. And one of them, you mentioned the cosmetics sector, and you have background working in L'Oreal before. Had you ever looked at going outside food and looking into encapsulating cosmetics, for example, like shampoos?
Yeah, so we're currently doing some work with a few selected partners on cosmetics. And I think there's some quite exciting things. In the past, we've looked at amenities for hotels, and that was quite exciting because, again, this is the kind of thing that you know is going to be used within a day, so it doesn't make sense to use plastic. In general, cosmetics is an interesting challenge because you remove the need for edibility, so there's a little bit more kind of like range of products you could be using for the packaging, but at the same time the formulations themselves are a little bit harsher than food, so it requires a bit of work, but it's definitely an exciting area.
Great. And on the same topic, just to go back on food, basically you mentioned it's edible, right? So how do you actually keep the surface and the bubble clean and safe to heat without the packaging?
Yeah, for sure. So again, we don't distribute our products like on the shelf in a supermarket. It's not a retailable product. So we really look at applications that are quite specific. So for example, the work that we do with ketchup and mayo sachets for the takeaway, this is actually placed directly inside of like your food order, maybe with your fries or your burger in a clamshell, and it's basically handled like food by the restaurants, just the same way the bun for your burger or your fries are. So that's the kind of like way we distribute our products. In terms of hygiene, one of the things that is interesting is that our products are much fresher than the typical kind of like sauce sachet that you might find in your takeaway. They haven't been in like multiple warehouses and trucks and being unloading and offloaded and so on for months. So actually, we tend to have a lot cleaner environment because the chain is much shorter, and that's really how we are seeing this to develop. Obviously, there is a lot of requirements around food, so we've worked really hard with all our partners, the food safety teams of PepsiCo and Unilever and Glucoside and all these guys, and you can believe me that they are very strict to basically comply with any of their requirements, which are usually going much further than the legal requirements. So that's something that we've done with all our partners, and we test with microbiology, so we have results from independent labs to validate all of that.
And someone is asking about two other markets potentially. One is the spirits market. If you have that request for like alcohol companies, for example, and the other one is the pharma industry.
Yeah, so the alcohol market is actually quite interesting. We've done quite a bit on that, and actually last October we had a funny experience because we've been doing cocktails, especially for festivals, for the past probably couple of years. But although it was quite successful, it never really kind of particularly went viral. But last October we did an activation with the Glenlivet, which is a whiskey brand from Pernod Ricard group, and that was for the London Cocktail Festival. and the video that they made went completely viral. I remember it was a weekend, and like I just kept on seeing like messages from different people that had seen this in lots of different places, and I just didn't understand how everything had just kind of like exploded so quickly. So I think in the end, they said that like that video and like the like media articles that like took off after that reached 1.8 billion screens, which I still find unbelievable. It went on like the news shows in the US, so it was on like Stephen Colbert and Trevor Noah Daily Show and Ellen Show, and it was just kind of like completely over the top for a relatively small activation that we had done in London. And I think what was quite exciting is that people were finding it completely crazy that you could drink whiskey that way, because whiskey is kind of like a classic drink that you're supposed to sip. So I think there was a lot of outrage that you would pop a capsule of whiskey in your mouth, but it worked really well. The brand was like super happy because they've never had that amount of exposure, and it really showed like the potential. And so now there's a lot of like follow-up opportunities that we are looking at with alcohol. Alcohol is a little bit tricky in terms of formulation. There's a little bit of work to make it actually like nicer to eat and to pop in mouth, because it changes a little bit the texture of the membrane. But that's what we are doing. So definitely a possibility. And if you have some ideas of places where you would love to have capsules of cocktails, don't hesitate to reach out.
I think about. I'll think about it. I thought as well about like the gastronomic sector as more like a marketing platform, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. And I think in a way, like at the moment, we are still relatively early stage, in the sense that for the past year, we've had like a couple of machines which are still prototypes. Now we are to the stage where we are able to bring more machines, build more machines, have a slightly bigger manufacturing capacity, and like this is increasing, but we're still in the early phase of all of this. So I think that once we have matured the technology, have several hubs in lots of different places, there's going to be probably a lot more opportunities to like to branch out to different applications. Right now we have this big focus on sauce sachets for the takeaway industry, and for like pre-packaged salads and meals in supermarkets, because that's a place where there is still a lot of activity even during COVID, and where we can replace actively plastic. So that's a starting point, but in a way the technology is much broader than this.
Fantastic. I'm just going through the questions right now. I think a lot of them we kind of like went through already. I have a very pragmatic one here from Tesi, who's asking, what's the load-bearing capacity of the capsule itself before it breaks?
So I'm not going to have a Newton value to give you live, but it's essentially within the world of fruits and vegetables. So I think it probably is like as resistant as like a strawberry or something like this. It's not very good top loading. So usually when we put them in like the secondary kind of like trays, delivery trays that we use, we probably put only 200, 300 units at once. And it's definitely soft. Actually, one of the things that we found out in the first trial we did with Just Eat, we had a formulaire that went with the sachets. And people were like, it's quite easy to open by just tearing a corner. And actually, it's one of the things that consumers get really annoyed about, like plastic sachet, because they are so hard to open, especially if you have slightly greasy fingers and so on. So ours is a lot more like opening like a clementine or an orange than about like this plastic thing that you have to tear. And so as a result, we were completely shocked that 92% of people found it easier or as easy to open as a plastic sachet. So that was quite a non-planned added value, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, they are essentially resistant like a fruit.
And about this just partnership in particular, like how did you go about capturing like customer feedback? Did they help you on that?
Yeah, so one of the great thing about Just Eat is that it's a digital platform. So there's a lot of things that you can do that you can't do with like physical retail. So you can follow up with emails. You can ask like customers, specifically the ones that maybe are like returning customers, to have their opinion rather than like someone who just ordered once. So there's a lot more you can do about trying to feedback some of the information to iterate, to improve the product. So definitely quite interesting.
Okay. And someone is asking about your competitive landscape, like who are your competitors currently, and do they do this? Does anyone out there does exactly the same thing as you do for the moment?
So I would say that currently no one has like an exact competing product, if that makes sense, in terms of technology. And I saw someone asking, sorry, about like IP and protection. We have obviously patents and copyrights and like all the due protections in place. But I think that, yeah, in terms of like slightly wider competition, there is definitely like a very active landscape of companies, startups, mainly, that are bringing some new exciting to the market. So I think it's literally every month there is someone who's creating some new packaging with some interesting biomass that you probably would have never thought could make it into packaging, from milk proteins to cacti to seashell to sand. There's just so many things that can be used for packaging. So it's quite exciting. As I said, we think that our solution works for very specific applications. So we don't claim to replace all the plastic in the world. And we think that actually we're going to need a wide range of solutions because we have a wide range of applications. Again, coming back to the analogy of the fruits, but essentially there's no two fruits that are similar because they have their own requirements. So we want to provide a few different fruits, and some other companies will provide others, if that makes sense. And I think that we really also want to work in conjunction with reusables whenever they are working. And we want disposables to be only a solution when we know that reusable aren't taking off, or that they're not going to have the impact that is required. So it's really all about finding a systemic solution that is very kind of like in the details, rather than like just a one material replaces all plastic. And personally, I'm super excited about all these other startups that are using from like beeswax to mushrooms to all sorts of like really interesting materials. And I think that each one of them have their particular set of like advantages and drawbacks. And if everyone sticks to what works for that material, then we're gonna maximize impact, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, there's someone asking about a use case we've seen quite a lot, which is straws. So have you ever considered using the material to make straws, for example?
Yeah. So I think that definitely straws are a big problem. I think it's been super interesting to see that product completely disrupted in a matter of years. Currently, we don't think that we have like the reasons to focus on that, because other companies are doing some great things. Typically, our products are flexible, and we kind of focus on like the barrier properties for flexibles for now. So I'm not saying that in the future we might not have some like rigid materials for cutleries or cups or so on, but I think that we definitely have a focus in flexibles for now. And there are like other companies looking at seaweed extracts or other kind of like plants to make straws. So that's quite exciting to see some alternatives on that front as well.
Fantastic. And someone is asking, so like a bigger, like long-term question, like where do you see the company in 5 years? Do you think you will still remain independent? What's your So like main goal in the next 5 years.
Yeah. So first of all, we are super lucky to have been backed by, first of all, in our first fundraise, people. So we failed to raise from angels and funds in the first, like when we first fundraised, and we were going to quit, but we decided to give it a last chance, a last push, and go for equity crowdfunding. And that turned out to work really, really well. And we are so grateful for the 900 people who helped us raise 850,000 pounds back in 2017. So it's quite exciting to have the support of like lots of people all around the world. And then after that, we've been able to continue financing the growth of the company with a really great team of impact investors. We have Sky Ocean Ventures. Recently, we've raised another round with Lupa Systems and Astanor, Torch Capital, Dune Foundation. So like funds that really have done a lot in investing in sustainability. And we think that it gives a lot of hope for like new emerging solutions to really reach scale with the power of like VC funding, but keep a really sharp focus on sustainability. For us, Notpla, we like, as you said at the beginning, our mission is to make packaging disappear. We want packaging that doesn't stay around, but that just kind of like does its mission and then kind of like goes back to nature. And I think that we usually say that our ambition is to become the Tetra Pak of sustainable packaging. So in that sense, we want to have a wide portfolio of different solutions so that companies can basically find the replacement for whatever plastic packaging they have within our portfolio. So the goal for us is to continue to bring more solutions, industrialize them, and make sure that they work and that they have the impact that we want them to have, so that, yeah, companies can basically say, okay, let's get rid of all the plastic that I don't need, and we want to be the partner to help them do that.
Great. And I got someone asking about where did you currently manufacture, and you mentioned before that you can also provide companies or events organizer with the actual machinery to create the Oohos. That whole sort of like manufacturing and appliance kind of element, how important is it within your business model? How do you see it?
Yeah, so it's definitely interesting because we do like basically just like under my desk that we have on the ground floor, we have the production unit. So we are able to produce like as a service, and it's much easier to start with than having to bring our machines to every new client that we might have. It just helps a lot to get things off the ground, and it helps us to improve the technology by practicing and learning about like the reality of production. But long term, you're right, our goal is really to lease the machines and sell the cartridges of materials that go into these machines, so that people can actually package their own products directly on site, the same way they would package them by having a plastic packaging machine and plastic. We want to be able to provide the material and the enabling equipment as a lease, because we also believe that it's a great way to create a circular economy. If the incentive of making those machines last longer rests on us, it's much better for a circular economy. So leasing model seems to be the best way for us to implement that. But that's the way we see this working. For the other products, the coating and the films, it might be a little bit different, because in that sense, we are using a lot more with existing machinery. So we don't really need to lease new machines. We are trying to use existing machinery, but with our materials. So in that sense, it's very straightforward. As a packaging material provider, we basically just sell materials to these companies.
Great. So I'm just being mindful of time. I just have one last question for you to wrap up the session. It was super insightful. Thank you very much. Do you have one piece of like practical advice that you want to give to any sort of like entrepreneur out there who is just starting their journey? And what was your biggest learning as a food tech founder?
Yeah, I think that it's really like, as much as possible, trying things and like getting validation or not about like that test from the market is really important. And sometimes you can spend a long time without having those kind of like touch points, just checking that things work. So I think that like trying to have those cycles as quickly as possible is really important, and especially in the early days, it might feel a little bit kind of like underdeveloped to start showing it to people or pitching it or trying to kind of like have some feedback from a real like client, but it's so valuable. So definitely doing a lot of that. And I think that yeah, like the time is really interesting because so many things are changing. I think that when we started, there was like a lot less of a investor landscape specifically backing like innovative food and sustainability. So I think that now it's very exciting because you actually have a box where you fit. You don't have to kind of like explain that you're a little bit this, a little bit that. So I think that it's really exciting, and I think that maybe, yeah, like the thing I wish we would have like done is maybe kind of like take more risk and bet on ourselves in a bigger way early on, to just try to kind of like get things started, rather than just kind of like working on the plan for a very long time before you actually kind of like give it a go. So, but at the same time, you can't rewrite history, and I think that we've learned so much in the way we've kind of like developed this. So there's probably nothing to change really.
Wow, and I think you're in a pretty good place. Pierre, we're just on time. Thanks a lot for today. I think it was really, really insightful. And thanks everyone for joining. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. And yeah,
You're
keep in
welcome.
touch.
Thank you,
Bye.
Pierre. Bye, everyone.